I'd like to introduce Mr. Bob Elworthy, AM, at our club today. Bob's going to talk to us about the Vietnam War, which is very pertinent because we're getting very close to Anzac Day. Vietnam War finished at December 1972, some 37 years ago, so gee whiz, time does fly. Bob Elworthy AM was a digger in the electronic warfare section of the Australian Army. A real spook, I guess. Bob was at the front line, Battle of Hatch Dick, is it, or Ditch, Bob?
Close enough.
Close enough. Vietnamese not that good. Operation Goodwood I can handle, which was a big operation over 3 months, from the 3rd of December 68 to the 19th of February 69. During that battle, unfortunately, Australia lost 21 good men and 91 persons were injured. Recently, Bob informs me that the Republic of Vietnam government awarded the Australian Army the Cross of Gallantry with Palm for the Hatch Ditch encounter with the Viet Cong. A very high and rare honour indeed. Bob is also president of the Vietnam Veterans Association and represents 50,000 Australians who fought in Vietnam. During Bob's talk this morning, he will focus on how he got to Vietnam. I guess he didn't have to pay too much money to get there, was it? First class ticket?
Well, no expense.
No expense paid.
No expense spared.
But the important part, Bob did come home. So Bob, welcome.
Thank you.
To the
Gentlemen, good morning. I hope that's loud enough for everybody. Yeah. I just heard some happy birthday calls. I reckon there'd be a few OBEs in the room, over bloody 80. You got a few of those? Yeah. Well, good on you, God bless you. There's a lot of good Australian history in this room, let me tell you. Look, it's a delight to be here. Firstly, thank you to Roger, who initially invited me, your past president. And I'd like to thank Philip down the front here, who's going to be my right-hand man, and whack up the slides as we go. Unfortunately, we had a couple of very, very short DVDs to show you. One was a tribute, if you like, to Australian Vietnam veterans, and the other was from my visit to Villers-Bretonneux on the Western Front. But unfortunately, for whatever reason, technical gremlins, that won't happen, but you're welcome to look at them at any time that Philip can make them available for you. I decided I wouldn't bang on about the Vietnam War as such because, I can answer whatever questions you'd like about it, but I thought you might be interested to know how I actually got there. To sort of put that in perspective for you, the Army has a rule and a regulation for everything. But it's a bit like a duck. On the surface, nice and calm, and underneath, paddling like buggery, if I can use that term. And that's basically how I got to Vietnam. It's the sort of thing you'd see in Dad's army. So I'd like to sort of take you through that, if I might. Now, I was just back from Singapore. I'd been back in country about a month, and I got the warning order that in 2 months' time I was to go to Vietnam. So what did that mean? Thanks, Philip. First of all, I had to front up at the Jungle Training Centre at Canungra and go through what they called a battle efficiency program for about 3 weeks or so, where they did unimaginable things to your body and trained you in the art of counterinsurgency warfare, if you like, in a jungle setting. Now, after 3 weeks of that, it was back to my unit, thanks Philip, where like all the other diggers about to go to Vietnam, I got one in each arm twice a day for 3 days. Cholera, black plague, typhoid, tetanus, you name it, we got it. Just like that poor Navy fella there's copping it. So for about a week or so, all these germs were fighting in your upper arms while you were getting ready to go. We got kitted out, and on the morning of that we were due to leave, of course the Army got me out of bed at 5 AM, as is usual. And as my warrant officer said to me, it's really easy to deploy you single fellas because we just pack you up and send you on your way. I said, what do you mean, sir? And he said, well, if the Army wanted you to have a wife, they'd issue you one. So I'm out of bed at 5, I've had my breakfast, and they put me in the old combi van at 7 o'clock in the morning and take me into Toowoomba, 40 minutes away. Now, if you've ever been in Toowoomba at 7:40, any day of the week, the lights aren't even on yet. No one's up, nothing. So there's me and my mate, the two of us heading off together, sitting on our backsides in Toowoomba. at the Greyhound terminal. Thanks, Philip. Where we waited for the bus to leave at about 11 o'clock. So we basically sat on the side of the road. So we've been up since 5 and it's now 11. We hop on the Greyhound bus with everything that we've got and off we go. Thanks, Philip. Now can we... now go back to the railway station, if you wouldn't mind. Keep coming back now. Terrific. So after 2 hours, the South Brisbane Railway Station. Now if you can imagine what that looked like in the 60s. Just like that, in fact. And I thought, hell, that's the train I'm getting on. What I got on was pretty close to that, let me tell you. So here we are, 1 o'clock, for a train that doesn't leave till 9:30. So my mate and I thought, this is no good. We've been given $4.20, which was to pay for our lunch and our dinner. So we went straight to the nearest pub and drank it. Then we thought, hell, 6 hours to go. What do we do now? Next slide, thanks, Philip. Now remember, we've got all our kit. We're ready to go and we're fully armed, ready to rock and roll. So what do we do? Well, we hired a little locker at the terminal there at the railway station, and we put all our gear in it, but we're not putting our rifles in there. So we slung them over our shoulder and thought, next slide, thanks, Philip, let's go see a movie. So off we went to see Catch-22. Now there's two diggers with their rifles over their shoulders, marching down the main street. Next slide, thanks, Philip. Didn't quite march as well as that, but that sort of gives you an indication of what we look like. Two of us striding through the main street of Brisbane when up pulled a very, very burly copper. Brown-shirted fella. All coppers in Queensland are burly, aren't they? I won't say fat, but they're burly. Where do you two think you're going? My mate turned around to him. I'll cut out the first part of his story. Where do you think we're going, you so-and-so, so-and-so? We're off to Vietnam. Pee off. And the copper said, well, where are you going now? He said, down to the movies. He said, what movie theatre? And we told him. He said, jump in. He gave us a ride. So we went down and we saw the movie. And then it's back to the railway station. We spent 12 hours in a dog box carriage to Sydney. No expense paid. We'd already eaten it. We'd already, drunk our dinner money, so we didn't have any money. All night in a dog box. So we arrive in Sydney the following day. We've been up for well over 24 hours now. Oh, in the back of a truck, out to beautiful Holsworthy. Now the Army had a delightful thing that they always did. They picked the worst piece of real estate in Australia and built a camp on it. Not like the Air Force or the Navy, who had all the good stuff. We got the rubbish. And Holsworthy on a weekend is not a place you want to be. There were about 300 of us in the barracks over the weekend, all heading off to Vietnam in one shape or another. And the local sergeants wanted us to stand guard and do this and do that and do whatever else. Well, you can imagine what the diggers said to the sergeants. So we spent a weekend there, bored as hell. Come Monday morning, up again at 5 o'clock, out to Mascot Airport. Thanks, Philip. For a plane that didn't leave till 11 o'clock at night. There's a saying in the Army, hurry up and wait. So there we were. We got a boxed breakfast when we got it there, courtesy of the RAF. Where's Alan? Alan knows all about boxed lunches from the RAF. It's a sandwich that's been in there so long the edges have curled up, an old apple that's gone brown, and some nondescript orange juice. Anyway, that got us through. And so finally at 1600 hours they formed us up and Skippy Squadron put us on a 707. Beautiful aircraft. So there we are, we all stomp on, we load our rifles into the top of it. We're off. Cattle class, at last we're off. Earlier in the morning we'd said goodbye to a whole bunch of our other mates who were sailing first class on HMAS Sydney. Next slide, thanks Philip. And there they are in their wardrooms, getting themselves all organised. So I'm not quite sure who got the worst end of the deal, us in the 7-0 or these guys on HMAS Sydney. So off we fly. It's quite late in the evening, 2300 hours. Next slide, thanks Philip. About an hour in, the pilot comes on and says, oh, this is the captain speaking, we've just had a bomb scare, we're going back to Sydney. Now there's about 150 very, very, excuse the French, pissed off diggers on this plane. We drunk all the grog that they had on board. And so they land us and taxi us out to goodness knows where and then made us get our bags out. And you can see my little expletive down the bottom. Yes, of course, Mr. Policeman, that's my so-and-so bag. Anyway, after what seemed an eternity, thanks Philip, back on the plane again, we're off! And the Qantas people had put some more grog on. So we were really happy. And we flew to Singapore. Now something really strange happened. Just as we were about to land in Singapore, this strange metamorphosis went over in the plane. Every one of us took off our army shirt and put on a Hawaiian shirt, or a blue shirt, or a grey shirt, or a pink shirt. So there's all these closely shaved, strong looking fellas, army boots and green trousers, wearing funny looking shirts, standing in the terminus at Singapore. Why? Because at that stage, the Singapore government did not admit that they were letting Australians pass through Singapore on the way to Vietnam. So clearly we were just tourists, weren't we? That's what I said. When people say, are you Aussie soldiers on the way to Vietnam? No, not me, mate. Not me. We stuck out like a sore toe. So finally, we're off again, and we land in country. Thank you. Tonsanut Airport. At the time when I landed there, it was the busiest airport in the world. Every aircraft of any shape, size was flying in and out, and that's our little 707 down the bottom there with us all getting off. And as I hopped off, the fellow I replaced said to me, mate, no one's got 364 days and a wakey left in this place. So you knew exactly what you were in for. Now after taking all this time to get there, we had some fellow yelling at us, move, 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 get your gear, get over there and get in the back of that Caribou. As we ran into the Caribou, they threw all this ammunition at us and we loaded up our magazines and popped them on and put one up the spout. And off we went for about another hour, until at last, thanks Philip, we arrived at Luscombe Field, Nui Dat. Tuesday at 6 o'clock, remembering I left at 7 a.m. on Friday. Courtesy of Wallaby Airlines, flown in the back of a Caribou brick truck. One of the most reliable aircraft ever to fly. Not all long ago retired. So I'm home at last. There's a vehicle waiting for me and a sergeant saying to me, Elworthy, where the bloody hell have you been? You're 2 days late. Anyway, I found my way to my new home. Absolutely first class. Air conditioned when the wind blew. All mod cons. Thanks Philip. Into my own tent. As you can see, I've got an ensuite at the back, my little space there, and as soon as I got there it was load rations, you're going out tomorrow. So off we went. Next slide, thanks. The toilets, magnificent. The old Thunderbox, about once a month they come along and fog it out. And then you'd sit on that and you'd exchange the old Truth newspaper or the Pix magazine that had been sent over and whatever else. No expense spared. No expense spared. Thanks, Philip. So in the dry season, it was lovely to be under the trees because it was dry, humid and hot. But one thing we always had, thanks Philip, was plenty of running water. And of course diggers always make do. And a lot of these things you see here, the diggers built for themselves, their own boozers, their own outdoor theatres. They made a cricket pitch, and we used to get some concert folk come in from time to time to say hello. But we always had plenty of running water, thanks Philip. Especially in the wet season, when it was wet, hot and humid. So you either had prickly heat or crutch rot. And this was the time of the year where your boots would fall apart and they'd go like that, and your uniforms would just rot off your body. Anyway, I survived. It's time to go home. Going home, no creature's comfort spared. Get on that Hercules and find somewhere to sit and throw your bag on the floor, was basically what we were told. And as we were about to leave, the loadmaster sung out, by the way, the Hercules that left yesterday still hasn't been sighted yet. So that filled us Australians with a great deal of comfort. Us diggers were getting on the back of that. So it was home courtesy of the RAAF after 12 months in country. Thanks, Philip. And that's me. I was young once and a soldier, and I was about 105 pounds wringing wet. When I was about to come home, that'd terrify anybody, a picture like that, wouldn't it? Thanks, Philip. Can I just say, I wouldn't have my time, if I had my time again, I would have done exactly the same thing. There's something special about being part of the profession of arms. It's a unique body of folk, and they're pretty special people. They're patriots and they're good Australians. I'm proud to say that the Vietnam veterans were as good as any soldier who ever pulled a boot on to defend this country. And the folly of the Vietnam War is that you never send soldiers to fight a war if you don't intend to win it. You never send soldiers to fight a war that's been sent there for political reasons and they find a political excuse to pull you out. Because at the time that the treaty was signed in Paris, the North Vietnamese were within 2 weeks of calling it off. They were decimated. The Paris Peace Accord allowed them to stay exactly where they were, didn't disarm them, didn't do anything about it at all. Let them sit where they were. 2 years later, the US Congress, particularly the Senate, decided they would not support South Vietnam as they promised they would do. And as a result of that, in 1975, South Vietnam fell to the communists. Now what does that mean for Vietnam veterans? Nothing. What it means is that we went and did our duty, and we did it well. What does it mean for Vietnam veterans today in terms of the social impact? A lot of Vietnam veterans had a less than joyous return to Australia. It's true to say that when young Australians were giving their lives in Vietnam, that unions were marching in the street protesting. It's true to say that when young Australians were dying in Vietnam, the Maritime Union of Australia refused to load ships to resupply the soldiers on the ground. It's true to say that as young Australians were dying in Vietnam, the student union at Monash University was supplying food, money and supplies to the enemy. Fortunately, we only got letters about every 3 to 6 weeks. So a lot of that stuff took a long time to filter through. Letters were the only way we could correspond, not like today. And so when the posties went on strike and refused to handle our mail, the puncher postie term came into vogue with Vietnam veterans, and a lot of postmen got a thick ear from a Vietnam veteran post the war. But what it left for Vietnam veterans was a legacy of a scar on their conscience, that for some reason the people in this nation who could not make the difference between government policy and a soldier doing what he's ordered to do, some people could not make that distinction. And it was appalling, some of the things that happened to some of the veterans, that forced them to take their own lives in numbers far greater than the numbers you're hearing about now, which, by the way, is another tragedy. It was also a tragedy too that the federal government wiped their hands of Vietnam veterans overnight. And it's only because of the Vietnam Veterans Association, where veterans turned inwards to themselves and decided, to hell with this, we're not going to put up with it, that we've been able to win the sort of Department of Veterans Affairs handouts that veterans now have. But for me, I'm a very, very, very proud Vietnam veteran. I'm proud to have served. I'm proud to have gone to Vietnam. I'm a career soldier, by the way. I was proud to have served, and I'm still proud to serve my fellow veterans to this very day. But it was interesting how you'll read about how the great deployments for the Second World War went and all that sort of stuff, and ships were sent off, and there am I, me mate. Basically, find your own way, mate. If they'd have been able to give us a ticket or enough money to go and buy an airline ticket, I reckon they would have told us, get over there by yourself. But that was the nature of the beast. I was there to replace a soldier who had done his time, and that's the way they did it. Just trickled them over and trickled them back. I was 21 at the time, so compared to a lot of soldiers, I was quite old because I'd already served in Singapore for a couple of years, as I mentioned. Post-Vietnam, I was commissioned from Officer Cadet School, Portsea. Served in Hong Kong and Pakistan, and also as a company commander at Duntroon, Royal Military College, Duntroon, before I resigned with the rank of Major. One of the lasting legacies from Vietnam for me has been my health. In 2012, I was diagnosed with an aggressive brain tumour, which fortunately has been removed, and that was directly related to my exposure to chemicals. It's one of the cancers that they've identified. So, like a lot of Vietnam veterans, I live with that, and I live with the other things. But would I take it back? No, sirree. Thank you for listening. I hope that I've given you just a little bit of an interesting insight on how people might get there without actually talking about the Vietnam War itself, but I'm also happy to do that. So no question is embargoed, no subject is off the record. You can ask me anything you like. Thank you very much.
Bob, how aware were you of Agent Orange?
I've got a photo of myself and 4 fellows wearing a pair of shorts, GP boots, dog tags and hats, taking it out of a 44-gallon drum with a bucket and throwing it on the weeds that were growing in the wire. So we were covered in it. We got no warning at all. No. The first inkling was the stench of it. Jungle smells in one way. The Agent Orange smelt of something that had been concocted by someone somewhere in a laboratory. And it made your skin crawl, you watched things just die in front of you. We had no knowledge, we were given no information about it at all.
Any more questions at this stage? For
Not putting on the spot, Bob, by any means.
Well, it's okay, you can put him on the spot if you like.
I actually had to fix up my speech because...
What I would like to hear is, and I'm sure everyone in the room would like to hear, is what you were doing in the back seat of that Pilatus Porter when you were up there.
Thanks. Thank you, Alan. Alan and I go back quite a way. Alan, of course, flew Phantom jets in Vietnam with the United States Air Force, so he's a hero Vietnam veteran in his own right. I was a Vietnamese linguist, and one of my jobs was to sit in the back of a Pilatus Porter, PC-9 I think it was, with a very young army pilot, and sturge around the bush and try and locate enemy radio transmitters. So we'd stooge around and try and get as close to them as we could and get a fix on them so that we could identify who was there, what they were doing and what their future intentions might be. So that was a pretty interesting job. If I can quickly relate one story about that to you. Have we got any ham radio operators in the room? No? The reason I ask that is because some of the Viet Cong transmitters made particular sounds when they were tuning them. And our intercept operators, our signals intelligence operators, were so skilled they could listen to the sound of a radio transmitter being tuned and identify it to the unit. And they could hear a Viet Cong person or a North Vietnamese sending Morse code, and after a while you learnt the hands of the different people and what units they belonged to. It was about 4 AM in the middle of one of the most violent tropical storms we'd ever seen, when a fellow who'd been sitting on the sets all night listening through the crackling heard a very, very, very faint sound of a radio transmitter being tuned. He quickly pressed a button that alerted 2 other people to come and listen, and he said, "I think that is VC 275 Regiment." That was one of the big regiments that stooged around in our area of operations that caused us a fair bit of grief. They pressed another button which made the unit stand to, and everybody rushed to their radios and started tuning, and sure enough, for the first time in about 8 weeks, the 275 Headquarters Regiment transmitter was active, and it was sending 4-figure high quality code, and they only do that in specific situations. In raced our intelligence linguists and our code breakers and started over the fella's shoulder while he's writing it down, breaking it. And it read, "After the attack, withdraw to the Nui Maytao Mountains. We immediately scrambled a PC-9 aircraft and sent it north to where we thought this transmitter was. The reason it became important was that Nui Maytao Mountains was an area in which they never ever operated. And they'd been quiet for 6 weeks. Why? Because they'd marched from where, close to us, up to the Nui Maytao Mountains. There was a mad scramble to identify the target, and we found 2 companies of Thai Rangers in a little defensive base about 3 kilometres away from where the aircraft flew and located the transmitter. There was a whole regiment of VC plus a battalion of engineers, it turns out, ready to attack the 200 Thais that were basically in a very, very loosely defended area with some American advisors. We quickly got on the blower, warned them out, and in the next 8 hours they fortified the area. They put all sorts of aircraft on standby, brought in some artillery from other areas to protect the base. When the enemy attacked, they ran into such a hellfire that they couldn't believe it, because basically they attacked with the best part of 1,000 men plus engineers, and they were just going to walk through this base and wipe it out. But they were met with such resistance and such fire that after 4 hours they had to break contact, because as soon as they started to attack, they were hit with aircraft, artillery, anti-personnel mines and directed fire. As a result, over 200 Viet Cong were left dead on the wire, and only 17 Thais lost their life. It would have been a massacre the other way around. We flew into the base the next morning to have a look at what had transpired. We also intercepted another message that day that said, take the wounded on this route. Our task force commander sent out 2 companies of Australians, and in the next 24 hours killed another 60 as they were leaving. So that was just a little snippet of what this little tiny unit on the ground of about 20 people managed to achieve in that one particular mission that came from one fellow hearing a radio transmitter, identifying it, identifying the unit and protecting the Thais. And that's the reason why our little unit was recently awarded the South Vietnamese CGWP. Thank you.
Can I ask a question about a bigger unit?
Yep.
Your current unit, Vietnam Vets Association. Have you got to where you... We can't fix up the old wounds, but have you got to where you want to be with the governments of the country at the moment?
Oh yeah, look, we will not achieve much more. We've basically been trying to just hold our ground, folks. We're trying to protect the Department of Veterans Affairs from becoming the Department of Human Services. We're trying to protect the Department of Veterans Affairs from becoming just a shop front that you go to Centrelink, take a number and form a line and go and see someone who has absolutely no inkling of what Defence Service is all about. So we're trying to protect that for the next generations and for our own. We've achieved as much as we can. We've put in place a Veterans Counselling Service which allows everybody in the family of younger veterans, including their wives, partners and children and grandchildren, to go and get the sort of counselling and debriefing stuff that soldiers need. But as far as us old fellas are concerned, and we've got Vietnam veterans who are 90 years of age now, and I'll be 70 at the end of this year, so it gives you an indication of how we're ageing very quickly. But no, we've achieved everything we can achieve, and we're just basically holding our ground now and trying to keep the governments, trying to keep them honest. And if there's one thing that we've achieved in the last 12 months, of which I'm very proud, there were a group of Southeast Asian Treaty Organisation civilian nurses sent to Vietnam as part of the CEDAW program in the very early 60s, and they worked in some of the most horrendous conditions. Fired upon, threatened, lived in squalor, worked in hospitals. There was a hospital in name only. They came home suffering all exactly the same illnesses as Vietnam veterans. We fought the government for 40 years, and last year we finally got the government to accept that they should receive the DVA Gold Card. And most of these people are in their 80s. So, I mean, it didn't cost the government very much. $9 million over 4 years, and they wanted to squalor with us. So last year we achieved it, and we got these blessed ladies and the other medical staff the Gold Card. 95% of Australians who were wounded that hit our hospitals survived because of people like that.
Any other? Oh, Mr. Wilson is going to... Oh, check it.
Barry's got one and I've got one too.
very interesting times for all of us, the Vietnam situation. I have a friend, a pilot, who's still suffering from lymphoma because of Agent Orange is registered and agreed. And we've also seen the museum, most of us who've been to Vietnam have seen the museum and the effects of Agent Orange. But the question is there any difference between those who have served in Iraq and Afghanistan who are disabled mentally or physically between the benefits you're fighting for and have fought for the Vietnamese veterans?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Without trying to bore you too much, Vietnam veterans are covered by a thing called the Veterans Entitlements Act, which was a specific act set up to look after Vietnam veterans. And if you like, it was typical of the government of the day. The VEA is basically give them some compensation and get them out of my sight. Get rid of them. The younger soldiers, male and female, are covered by a thing called the MRCA, which is the Military Compensation and Rehabilitation Act. And what they try to do with the younger people is to not just pension them off, not just throw them on the scrap heap, but to rehabilitate and to get them back into the workforce if they can. So there's a completely different intent of the Act. So I think the simple answer to your question is that in monetary terms the younger veterans are far better off, but that's because of the times. They need to be. They have access to lump sums, they have access to all of the medical assistance that Vietnam veterans have, and their families have a much more wider scope for access to services than we ever had, simply because society now understands that the support for these veterans doesn't stop after they've been deployed. For instance, I know in Townsville, if younger veterans come back from a deployment overseas, some of them will spend time in camp for about a week and go through a decompression program, which is something we sorely needed. I landed in Melbourne after flying home in a Herc in the middle of a protest. Was put on a bus, taken into Little Collins Street, Little Flinders Lane, given $100, told to take my uniform off, go on leave and come back in 2 weeks. 24 hours before that I was in the back of a porter doing an operation.
So we have learned.
We learned, and there's still a long way to go. But now you'll find, for instance, there'll be psychologists embedded with army units overseas, and there'll be all sorts of programs whereby younger soldiers can go and self-report to get medical help now and not be thrown out of the army like they used to. So we're pretty proud of that. Long way still to go, but I think it's fair to say that our veterans system in Australia is the best in the world. The best in the world. You'd hate it to be as bad as the Americans.
That's good. Roger?
Rob, Vietnam's a very, very popular place to go for a holiday. I've actually been there a couple of times. But have you been back? And secondly, how do you feel about that? Do you feel a sense of achievement? That here we are, we've got a nation now that South Vietnam is being able to welcome the world to them. And the other thing I wanted to just say, when we've been there, a lot of the people can't tell the difference, they said, between the Viet Cong and the South Vietnamese.
There's a fair bit to that question. Yeah, I went there once for a year, didn't like it much. But I did go back. In the very early 90s, in fact, so I haven't been back since then. So I was quite a young fella going back, and I went back pretty quickly after the time was over. Sorry, that's okay. It's just the sound of one of the DVDs. It's a beautiful country geographically, and the people are really nice people. I have a close relationship with the Vietnamese community in Victoria, and especially the Vietnam veterans. What can I say about Vietnam now? It's unified. It's a communist country. They still purge anybody who's had the slightest relationship with anything from the former regimes, including Vietnamese veterans, their families. Poverty is rampant. Human rights don't exist. So from that point of view, when you go to Vietnam, yes, you'll see nice sights and meet lovely people. But underneath all of that, not as bad as North Korea, but you know, you get my drift.
Not far away.
Not far away.
Alan?
Rob
Alan.
Allen, sorry. In '63, I was the first engineer officer of a ship called the Husang, and we were in Vietnam to load broken rice for the Filipino army, who were nearly in dispute with the government. But at the time, Ngo Dinh Diem was assassinated, and Madame Nhu was kicked out, and Saigon was put under martial law. When the curfew was lifted, and it was great fun being at anchor in the middle of the Saigon River, having Marshal Key and his Corsair fighter bombers using your masts as a line-up to attack the Navy base up the river. But my impression was that Saigon itself bloomed. The women started wearing coloured clothes, where Madame Nhu said you could only wear white clothes, the low dye. And the people themselves seemed to be relieved that they were, they've escaped the oppression of Ngo Dinh Diem and his government. I think that was one of the reasons why the Viet Cong got so much civil support in South Vietnam. What are your thoughts on that?
There were a number of leaders of the country right throughout the Vietnam War, and without putting too fine a point on it, most of them were corrupt and lived a life of luxury. There's a wonderful monument to 5 generals who all assassinated themselves, killed each other, or committed suicide just at the fall of Saigon because they just couldn't bear it anymore. Saigon was a very interesting place. I only passed through it a couple of times. But you're right, all the ladies were wearing very colourful aoyes. I was in a group of ladies yesterday and there was about 60 of them all in the various colours. There's no doubt that all of the Far East, all of the Free World forces in Vietnam were fighting with one hand tied behind their back. The South Vietnamese army were very, very brave, and they were slaughtered in their hundreds of thousands. But the government at the top has proven, history has proven, were very corrupt, which is very sad. But Marshal Key, he was larger than life, with his pearl-handled pistols and his moustache and all that sort of stuff. It's very sad, because I also talked to the Thai Vietnam veterans and the Filipino Vietnam veterans and the Korean Vietnam veterans. And they're like us, all very proud of their service, but very sad for the way it ended and the way that they felt that they were restricted in what they could do. Even back then there were some rules of engagement, and that's fine if both teams play by the same set of rules. And that's, we've seen that through the Middle East and through the countries that we've been embroiled in of late. So no doubt Saigon was a very, very busy, active and thriving city. And to a large extent, except for the occasional incursions and, of course, Tet offensives, you could have almost thought there's no war going on in Saigon because of the way the place hummed along, except for every second person was in uniform. But it really was and still is, a beautiful and vital city. Some of the French colonial buildings there are stunning to see. Most of them in disrepair, but you get that feel of how vibrant a place it would have been in very early part of that century. But 63, that was before the first Australian people were put on the ground in Vietnam. 64 was the first.
Just as an aside, Bob, one of my previous engagements, I worked for Ford Motor Company, and during 68, 69 we happened to visit commercially Saigon. And for all intents and purposes, yes, there were a lot of uniforms around, but Saigon wasn't at war at all. It was not quite party town, but it was in an envelope that not everyone experienced, so it was quite. Ellen.
Bob, come this Anzac Day, Vietnam veterans, I gather, will be marching again. Over the years that you've been marching, have you discerned any difference in the public mood towards people marching?
Do you mean Vietnam veterans marching or people marching in general?
In general.
Maybe I'm not the right person to ask about Anzac Day, because I've got some pretty strong opinions about who should and shouldn't be marching, to be honest. If I can just put that in perspective for you, gentlemen, I was greatly honoured to be the Honorary Secretary of most of the battalion associations in the 16th Division. My dad was a member of the 2nd 5th Infantry Battalion in the Second World War. And they would proudly march each year. When I first went to Anzac Day, there'd be hundreds of them in gabardine coats with their hats and their Gladstone bags marching proudly up the road. Tall, strong. Slowly waned until you've got one or two that can hardly make it up the road. And then it got to the stage where the banner was out the front and there was a bedraggled bunch of next of kin wandering along behind them, some wearing Essendon footy jumpers, some wearing Collingwood footy jumpers, pushing prams, having a great time. I turned around and said, no, that's dishonouring the veterans. I'm not going to march that banner anymore. My personal opinion is that Anzac Day, veterans march first, and at a given point in time, whatever time they might set, or whether it's a bugle call or whatever, the official part of the march ceases, to be followed by a walk of remembrance by all the next of kin who want to form up in St Kilda Road and walk to the shrine. The next of kin, this might sound harsh, are simply there marching because of fate. This business of carrying photos, which is a tradition that I do not like because it's not Australian. And quite frankly, the majority of the people who march don't necessarily understand the right protocols and how to behave themselves. And it's like trying to herd chooks. So my opinion is the march is for the veterans. At a certain time, the official part of the march stops, and then everybody, I'm not suggesting next of kin shouldn't participate, but they then take part in a walk of remembrance to the shrine following the march. Personal opinion only.
Thanks, Bob. This is a big thing, this microphone in this place. Got to get it right. I'd like to thank on a personal basis, but officially I'd like to ask Roger Wilson to come up here and on behalf of the club say thank you very much for a most informative speech. Thank you.
Just before he does, I think the one thing that we need to bear in mind about the Vietnam War, it was the first war that you could sit down and watch it on TV. It was the first war that was reported in a way that was skewed. You didn't hear about Australians building windmills and orphanages and spending the one day a month off that they had going out helping civil aid teams look after poor people, rebuilding houses and so on. You didn't hear about any of that. What you heard about is what the press wanted you to hear, with little grabs. A classic example is Tet 68, when in fact 80,000 North Vietnamese and Viet Cong were killed. But it was portrayed as a victory for them because they managed to get into Saigon and other places. But they got kicked out and they were on their knees. And that's how this sentiment started to build up, this anti-Vietnam War sentiment started to build up, because people, after 10 years, you become sick of it. And I remember the headlines when the first digger was killed, it was on the front page of the Herald Sun. By 1968-69 you had to go to page 15, and next to that would be your advertisement for the new Ford car, and down the bottom there'd be a little bit saying that a couple of Australians got it today. So it was the first war that was in our lounge rooms. And it was the first war really where Australians, to a great extent, did not have to give up anything. Remember the First World War and the Second World War, they were country efforts. Except for those family members actually involved with sons and daughters in Vietnam, the rest of the country just sort of hummed along. It was just another sideshow of the crazy 60s, you know, sex, drugs, rock and roll and the Vietnam War. So I think that helps to put in perspective a lot of people's attitudes to Vietnam and the Vietnam veteran soldiers when they first came home. Thank you.
I first heard Bob talk to 800 boys at Brighton Grammar. His speech that day was outstanding. Completely different from today. And your story about how you got to Vietnam, when you told me over the phone that's what you're going to do, was most interesting in itself as a lead into talking about Vietnam. You are a great ambassador for Australia, and what you've done for the Vietnam veterans is outstanding, and we should be proud of him for doing that, because it was a very big battle when the diggers came back from Vietnam to try and get recognition, and Bob's been very polite about talking about that and didn't want to get involved in the politics today. But I'm sure you've all enjoyed, particularly during the question time, all the answers you've given have been very frank, and we thank you on behalf of the Beaumaris Probus Club for being with us today, and you're going to join us for lunch, I think you said you are. So you want to
Thank you, it's been a privilege. Thank you, James.
There's something happening here. What it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there, telling me I got to beware. I think it's time we stop. Children, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down. There's battle lines being drawn. Nobody's right if everybody's wrong. Young people speaking their minds are getting so much resistance from behind. Time we stop. Hey, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down. What a field day for the heat. 1,000 people in the street, singing songs and carrying signs, mostly say hooray for our side. It's time we stop. Hey, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down. Strikes deep into your life, it will creep. It starts when you're always afraid. Step out of line.